Hi everyone. Bonjour. Vanakkam, as we say in Tamil as well. My name is Nikki Ramesh. I'm a woman of Indian origin. I'm also based out of Toronto, Canada. And today I'm wearing DQ's Digital Equality is my jam t-shirt. And if I say so myself, I'm rocking it quite well. I have long black hair, I'm brown skinned, and I'm really excited to be here today and really excited to talk about something that's very close to me, measuring and benchmarking accessibility. So a bit about who I am. I currently work at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. As Tilly mentioned, I work on a lot of digital experiences and how we can remove barriers within those as the senior manager for product accessibility. I'm also a co-founder of Access Success. For those of you who don't know it, it's a not-for-profit based out of Canada that supports accessibility startups as well as MBA students with disabilities. And that's really where my passion and my awareness of the barriers around us really surfaced. Outside of this, I am also a committee member on what's called the Accessible Standards Canada. This is a technical committee that sets standards for various federal organizations in Canada, and I focus on service design there and how we can improve the design and delivery of programs and services. And when I'm not at work, you can find me dancing to soca music. I love Afro beats as well. Those are really all a part of my jam. And if you want to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn at Nikki Ramesh, that's Niki, and my last name is Ramesh, Ramesh. Before I get into the talk, I also wanted to acknowledge that this might be a difficult time for many folks who work in accessibility, equity, and inclusion, as a lot of companies are going through restructuring and layoffs. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this might be a hard time, but the learning doesn't stop. And so today I want to talk a little bit more about how to look at accessibility measurement holistically. I'm hoping you walk out of this looking beyond just digital experiences. I'll use a media company, in this case, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, as a baseline, and then review various ways to measure accessibility on both the digital side and the content aspect of it as well. We'll learn how to benchmark accessibility and then a little bit more about what you can do in your role. And just a little note that the talk will focus more on measuring the customer experience, so the external facing experience, not so much on the employee side, just based on my expertise. And I've tried to include real examples that is publicly available throughout. And where I don't have, I've also created some hypothetical examples just to give you a sense of what we're learning about today. Okay, so first up, I want to introduce the concept of content versus container. And you're probably wondering what this giant animated tomato can is doing on the screen. So I want to make a differentiation between the content and then the the container that holds the content. So in the case of a tomato soup, you might purchase a tomato soup. Say the can is really hard to open for you. No matter how good your tomato soup tastes, you might hesitate to buy it again. In the context of a media company, it's very much the same aspect. So as someone, an audience member who comes in, they look at our content. So it might be a TV show, a news article, could be even ads. But then they also think about the container, the platform through which they're accessing the content, which could be a cable channel, it could be a website, it could be a voice assistant, it could be a smart TV. There could be many different containers. And the reason I differentiate between these two and call them out explicitly is because they're both very, very important for your user experience overall. Getting one thing right, but not the other, will ultimately impact your measurement and how you holistically think about whether you're creating an impact for the end user. The ideology of content versus container can really go well past just media. I think it applies really in any industry. Like you might take the example of a bank, for example. The content in there might be specific programs that help underrepresented groups, new immigrants, or People with disabilities get easier access to low interest loans. That might be the content. But the container might be there are websites through which they sell, physical locations, things of that nature, all of which are relevant to your user experience and the end customer experience. All right. So before you set measures and measurements of accessibility, you need to think about what your accessibility goals are. And I have some examples here to help you think about what is the end outcome you're working towards. From a content perspective as a media company, we're often thinking about one, how can we help audiences connect with our content? How do we make them feel like they can see themselves and feel represented in our content? Another goal might be, how can we remove attitudinal barriers around disability? So as a media company, we have a lot of power to get out the right message. Let's try and educate people on disability. From a platform perspective, in my day-to-day work, I'm often thinking about my goal is how do I improve the user experience and usability with assistive technology? I'm also thinking about operationally, how can I decrease time it takes to resolve identified issues? Your accessibility goals can also be driven by legislative requirements. So for example, if you're an organization in Canada, we have something called the Accessible Canada Act, which is kind of like the Americans with Disabilities Act in Canada. And so the ACA requires any federally regulated organization to set clear metrics for each of their accessibility goals, and then also provide progress reports on how they're advancing against their work. Another operational accessibility goal you might have is knowledge and skills. So how can you improve accessibility knowledge for specific roles within your company? Perhaps you're thinking, my goal this year is to increase awareness of user needs at a senior leadership level. That is your goal, then that will drive what measurement or outcome you set as a result of that. I'm going to go over a 2x2 table sort of matrix of how I view measurement metrics in media. This is my perspective. It can change company to company, but as you're going through, think about how this applies to your nature of work or what you hope to be working on in the future. So your metrics can be often either customer facing or they can be operational, external or internal. And they can be framed around the content or the platform, going back to my initial content versus container analogy. From a customer facing perspective, you might be thinking about things like representation on screen, measuring representation on screen, measuring customer perception or satisfaction, measuring availability of content alternatives. So content alternatives meaning the availability of things like closed captioning or described video, or I guess audio description, as you call it in the rest of the world, availability of sign language, availability of transcripts. All of these are alternatives to content that can be very clearly measured. From an operational perspective, on the content side, you might also be thinking about representation within production crew, writers, creative roles. So things behind the screen that ultimately drive what is produced and shown externally to audiences. There's also things like independent producers. So people who you work with externally, external producers who create content for you and how they have similar metrics like representation in their content. I'll switch over to the platform side now. So from a platform perspective, on the customer-facing side, you will be thinking about things like usability scores. So how usable is my experience? Things like task completion rates. How easily can someone go through an experience without any barriers? You might even be, from a more monitoring perspective, thinking about what are the number of WCAG-based issues, web content accessibility guideline-based issues that could be your metric there. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later as I differentiate between automated and manual testing as well. Operationally, indicators of whether or not your platform is accessible, things like cost to fix accessibility issues. So how long does it take once an issue is identified for a product team to fix the issue, retest it, have it out to the customer, and get feedback from the customer as well. You might also be thinking about supplier accessibility. So if you work with external suppliers and procure some of their software, hardware, things like that, I will go over that in a bit more detail. So what I'm going to do with the remaining time, I'm going to go over about 4 or 5 different metrics in a little bit more detail, such as representation on screen, customer perception, usability, and task completion, and then supplier accessibility as well. Okay, so let's move into the first one, representation on screen. So think back to when I told you about what is your accessibility goal ultimately. So say we as CBC come forward and say, or really me as Nikki, I'm going to talk about this from my individual perspective. My goal is to remove attitudinal barriers around disability. And one way that I will measure this goal is by looking at representation on screen, which can directly impact the goal I'm trying to work towards. So when thinking about representation on screen, you want to think about how you're collecting, managing, and visualizing demographic data about guests who might be appearing in programming. And this can be based on publicly disclosed information. So perhaps you have a guest who has previously spoken about their disability or has previously participated in a show with you. Or you might be thinking about self-disclosed information. And this can apply very broadly. Anytime you bring in a new participant, you have them self-disclose whether or not they identify. And so the metric that you're trying to measure here is percentage of guests who self-identify as having a disability. You can take this information and further break it out. So depending on how much data you have available and how in depth you want to go into it, you can start thinking about comparing things like time spent on air and guests in key roles. For example, is someone with a disability appearing as the host for an Olympics or Paralympics related TV show versus someone who's not? Things like that. On the right, I have a very simple representation, an horizontal bar chart that indicates hypothetically that between October and December 2023, we had 11% of guests with a disability and 89% of guests without a disability. Continuing in the same theme, my next goal is helping audiences connect with our content. And one of the ways I'm going to measure whether we're reaching this goal is getting customer perception feedback. So perception of accessibility is a really important measure. And I might even go as far as to argue that perception of accessibility and disability inclusion is more important than actual representation in some cases. Because for perception to change, you need to have significant noticeable changes in order for someone's perception to shift. And so often marketing teams will have perception surveys, which is a great place for you to embed disability and accessibility perception in there as well. So if I take the example of CBC Radio Canada, our audience research team surveys Anglophones and Francophones, so English and French speaking individuals in Canada, every quarter on various topics, including reflecting diversity and representation of people with disabilities. And so the specific metric that they're trying to measure here is the percentage of users that agree or strongly agree that CBC Radio Canada reflects people with disabilities in its content. Notice how I'm not talking about setting up a measurement that's something that's completely new, but using an existing process and existing measures to embed disability and accessibility within it. And this is really important for these measures and metrics to make sense. I'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. but I just wanted to point that out as well. I'll now switch into usability testing. So the goal here is to improve user experience and usability with assistive technologies. There's many different ways you can look at usability testing metrics. This is probably a topic that's talked about very often, so I'll touch on it here, but you may or may not. There's probably more deeper articles that you can find online. So the first one is task completion. So what is task completion? How many users can complete key task flows within a certain product? So task completion is often the end metric is percentage. So percentage of users who can complete task flows within a product. For example, finding election results. The second metric that you can use here in a digital context is things like number of issues. We talked about this earlier, issues logged based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and this can be determined through automated testing or manual testing. And lastly, and very interestingly, and this is probably one of my favorite metrics to use in order to measure progress, is the accessibility usability scale. And this is created by a company called Fable Tech Labs. So what the accessibility usability scale is it effectively asks a user to test your product or service and then answer a series of questions. So for example, how easy to use was this product? Would you come back to this product? Would you recommend this product to someone else to use? And all of these are very clear indicators of how much someone enjoyed your experience. So you now shift the perception from just thinking about, am I meeting a certain compliance or standard requirement, to, is someone enjoying the product? What is the level of satisfaction in using this digital product? And how can I improve that? So that's really the shift in the measurement criteria itself. I briefly talked about automated tests as a starting point. So there's a lot of automated tools today that are amazing at offering things like dashboards, or and some of these are available for free, some of them are paid services, but they can help you track, for example, compliance to WCAG 2.2 standards, which is the latest standard that's come out. You're able to see an output of a dashboard, you can see a score, you can see things like number of issues you've identified, things of that nature. So if I use the example of Skyscanner UK, and I was talking with someone over there, Heather Hepburn, who leads digital accessibility over there. So at Skyscanner UK, as a starting point, one of the first things they said was, our goal is to reach 95% of accessibility with web products with 0 critical fails. So what that means is we're going to have a score, a usability score of 95%, and we're going to have 0 critical fails against a certain compliance or standard requirement. And then they had weekly progress on reports on main pages to track operational excellence, which is really cool because as a product team, you're getting real-time information on how your product is doing. Keep in mind, and this comes with many, many caveats, automated tests only identify less than half of the potential issues. This is a well-known or historically known. I do recognize that a lot of companies are now using AI to improve the quality of the tests and improve the quality of the output, reduce things like false positives, but it cannot be your only way to measure. Manual tests, of course, give more coverage, but they also require more time. And nothing really replaces testing with real disabled users. That's the ultimate metric that informs your usability score. If you're interested, you can reach out to Heather Hepburn to learn a little bit more about what they're doing at Skyscanner UK. So thinking about usability in a product development perspective, to me, I broadly view product development in 4 stages. You have research, design, development, and then ongoing basis. In the research stage, where you're trying to identify the needs of users with disabilities and build new product features, often the types of tests that you're doing might be things like user interviews or focus groups or surveys, things of that nature. And the metric here that you can quantifiably measure are things like perception scores or the accessibility usability scale that I talked about earlier. In design, you want to start thinking about as you have prototypes and wireframes, and you might be doing some wireframe prototype reviews. You want to continue with the usability scores as a way to measure your progress here. When you shift into development and you have something tangible that assistive technology users can interact with within your product, you want to start shifting your focus to task completion. So how easy is it for someone to complete key tasks within the product? You also start thinking about metrics and around number of issues, which can continue. And then finally, on an ongoing basis. So this is benchmarking over time to make sure your product continues to remain accessible over time. So you want to start thinking about continuing to measure task flow completion rates for critical flows. You might also want to engage in things like user interviews at this point in time and look at usability scores, because you can then feed back into your research back to stage 1, and you start thinking about, hey, what are the needs or the gaps that I'm not meeting? What are new product features that we can be building or enhancing existing offerings that we have today? I've gone through many different metrics. You don't have to do them all at once, but I do want to give you a breadth of different types of measurement information that you can use on a day-to-day basis in your work, or you can also use to report back into a broader organization, other stakeholders of that nature. Okay, the last metric I'll touch on is supplier accessibility, and this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, and often I think undersold. Your goal here is to improve user experience and usability with assistive technologies. And that doesn't just mean products you build, it could be products that you're procuring from an external supplier. So you want to hold your suppliers to the same standards that you hold yourself to. And one of the ways to measure whether or not you're doing that is to think about, 1, how many contracts do we have which have accessibility clauses in them? And you can, if you have a lot of suppliers you work with, you can try and set a threshold on it. So for example, all the suppliers or all contracts with a value of over $50,000, hypothetically speaking, how many of those have accessibility clauses built into them? You can also apply similar digital accessibility metrics to your supplier's products. So often you might be asking suppliers to give you an audit report of their product or service. Along with that, you can ask them to give you metrics around the number of issues that they're identifying, number of issues they're identifying on a consistent basis. So on every quarterly basis, every 6 months. This is something I do with a lot of our suppliers we work with. We have quarterly reviews, and every quarter I will ask for a progress update on how many issues were identified last time, how many have you resolved, how many are you still working on or in your roadmap for the next 3 months. A really interesting in evolution to supplier accessibility is broadening into supplier diversity. So thinking about the supplier itself, their ownership, the employees on their side, are they from underrepresented groups? Because often we see that when they care and it's personal and they're personally vested in it, the output or whatever you're procuring from them likely also has accessibility built in from design and not as an afterthought. So we talked about a lot of different metrics, and yes, it's not as easy as it seems, right? Because the part where it becomes a struggle and where we are challenged often with setting up a measurement, one, things like getting disclosure information. So not everyone wants to disclose, nor do they feel the need to disclose. When I talked about representation on screen, that's one thing that we struggle with in my day-to-day work. It's a very real struggle where we don't have consistent information across different regions. The other aspect is having multiple lines of business and products. So different product teams work differently. Different product teams have different levels of maturity. Some of them may have really clear points of interaction with accessibility and really clear measurements set up throughout the process. And for others, it might purely be doing just an automated test, and that's the only output that you're getting out of the process. So having consistency across the process is hard, and having collecting the right kind of data is also often really can be a struggle. I'll finish off today with a little bit about benchmarking. So it's great you measured a certain piece of work, or you measured perception once. Cool. How do you know you're consistently doing it? How do you know you're improving or getting worse, or just maintaining? Like, all of those things are really important. Either you're doing better, you're worse, or you're where you are when you started. And so in a digital context, actually, before I talk about digital, I will briefly touch on from a content perspective. I talked about perception surveys. Those are really easy to replicate on a quarterly basis. If you have a pool of users that you usually test with, having this unmoderated source of information go out every 3 to 6 months and getting user feedback or getting survey results on it and specific metrics on whether or not you're representing is fairly easy to set up. From a digital perspective, I'll use the example of CBC. For a lot of our products, the way we benchmark is we have recurring usability tests. So every 3 months, we'll ask our pool of testers with disabilities, or if it's an employee-facing product, like an internal system or tool, then our employees with disabilities to complete a series of important tasks within the product. So in the context of a media company, it might be things like searching for local news, browsing new shows, or even things like logging into your account. All of these are key flows. Our goal here is we want users to be able to complete all the tasks with no barriers. So task completion rate is 100%. That's the metric that we're working towards. And additionally, we also want to reduce the number of issues identified over time. So we have our first example here. I'll go over two. The first one is where we have product benchmarking with consistent results. So in the first example, between July 2022 to March 2023, we asked users to perform some common tasks like finding, reading, and commenting on articles. And we had 100% task completion rate. So users of assistive technologies were able to do all of these tasks without any key barriers. The secondary goal, as I mentioned, is also to reduce number of issues experienced. And what's really interesting is we noticed that we started with 13 issues, and then it dropped to 11 issues, 10 issues, and came down to 0 issues at one point in time. So there was a linear, almost correlation in some sense to task completion and total issues identified. The longer the user was consistently able to complete tasks, the lower our issues reduced as well. What this doesn't tell me, though, is why this happened, and that's something benchmarking may or may not tell you. Benchmarking can give you an indication of which direction you're headed. However, the why behind it is often a lot more specific on a case-by-case basis. So in this example, the team had actually implemented some new processes where they had additional design reviews that were happening with early prototypes and wireframes. So as a result, when something was developed, the number of issues that came up at that point in time were a lot lower because they'd been identified and addressed much earlier in the process. You might not always see consistent results, though. You might have inconsistent results in a very similar benchmarking exercise. So in the second example, we noticed that the task completion started at 100, dropped down to 40, and then went back up to 80 and then 100. And you continue to see the correlation between task completion and total issues identified because we started at a lower number of issues. When the task completion dropped, the issues increased, and vice versa. When task completion increased, the number of issues dropped, and it stayed on that way. So it's fairly intuitive. It's not. This should feel pretty natural. Of course, you're saying, hey, if something is hard to complete, I'm likely facing more issues there. But the data just continues to prove that hypothesis as well. Now, the real insight in here is how you take this data and one, use it as a reporting feature. So you can use it to report to executives. You might use it as part of quarterly reporting or monthly reporting on your product. But you might also use it to investigate the root cause of where we're going wrong. Why is it that we saw a sudden spike in number of issues? Was there any new features added? Was there a change or an upgrade in assistive technologies? We often see that screen readers keep changing. There might be new updates. What is the root cause of it? And that's really what you can do as a next step from this benchmarking. All right, I'll close off today with a few thoughts on what you can start doing. Identify one goal and outcome or metric that you're trying to develop. Going back to the start, what is your accessibility goal? And the goal can focus on the content or it can focus on the platform, the container. It's really, really important to share results continuously with peers, with leaders, and even through champions group, because everyone wants to see the impact of their work, and it shows in the numbers, it shows in the feedback you're getting from users. You want to try and integrate accessibility measures into what exists already. So look at broader, maybe company analytics work, reporting work. I'm sure there's some research that's happening, or there might be a lot of existing analytics teams or reporting teams in your company. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. So try and use what's already there and include questions or metrics in there around disability and accessibility. And then the continuous learning doesn't stop. So using examples of other organizations who measure well, I believe Level Access also has a really good article on this. I can probably share this after the talk on other organizations that do a good job. So it's important to continuously kind of keep the loop going. And that brings us to today's learning on measuring and benchmarking accessibility.
Thank you, Nikki. You were super awesome. We have lots of questions to get to. Everyone in the audience, Nikki said that she will answer all of them, but we will do most of that offline, and then we will post the answers to this event page. So we'll take a few of them now, but we decided not to rush through it because I also had a whole bunch of questions. So let me give you the first one. Do you have any overall advice about defining measurement strategy? In my role, from this participant, I'm fairly focused on the digital experience. What can you help them with?
I think it's really important. I keep going back to what's your accessibility goal here. And I'm sure as an organization, you're not thinking about your accessibility as just a digital experience, because that's not what will keep customers coming back. And what really, really drives is what are you trying to achieve overall for customers with disabilities. That will drive the metrics and the measurement strategy you take. And it can be a combination of digital. I spent quite a bit of time at the start talking about content accessibility, which is crucial for a media company. Yeah, I'm happy to, if you have specifics on industry or things like that, I'm happy to help you brainstorm a bit more, but it really starts with what is the accessibility goal that you're working towards. And it cannot be just a very high level, we want to be more accessible. What does that mean? Like, who are you trying to be accessible for? What value are you bringing to their life? That's what you need to think about.
Very good, thank you. The second question here that I'm going to give you, Nikki, do you have any goals to improve your existing benchmark by a certain percent year over year? In other words, how do you measure success of the actual benchmarks?
That's a great question. So right now, I don't have a goal. I've set it. I've set it at 100% task completion. Like we always need to have 100% task completion. What I want to shift to at some point in time is I want to also add in a third metric in here around usability scores. I briefly talked about that. So I talked about the Fable accessibility usability scale. I want to incorporate that into our benchmarking because that tells me what opportunities are there over time, not just where like can we complete tasks today that are critical, but how can we improve the experience over time. So if when we get to starting to incorporate that, I see some of my benchmarks being around the 80s to 85 out of 100 being sort of the goal I would set then.
Very good. I'm going to give you two questions together now. They relate to one another, so let me read the first one. Thanks for this presentation first. How would you navigate testing for accessibility, usability, if access to participants is limited or difficult to do? What metrics would you focus on then? And then the second question that's related is, how do you recruit participants with disabilities?
Okay. This delves into a lot more usability testing, which is great. There's no easy way to recruit participants. I will say that off the start. Either you have to be willing to put money behind it, or you have to be willing to put time behind it. If you're willing to put money behind it, there are a lot of amazing vendors today who can help set up a recurring pool of participants for you and really make it a very simplified process for you to be able to talk to the participants, do your testing, get feedback, get metrics. If you're in a position where you do not have the money and maybe you're in a really small team, you're starting to build accessibility awareness in your organization, you're trying to evangelize that you're as a one person really out there, I would lean a lot more on the research team to try and build a pool of participants. So you can build a pool of participants by going out to social media groups. You can ask people, hey, this is what I work on. I'm trying to build a pool of participants. We offer some minimum compensation. If you're willing to be a part of our pool, please sign up using this process, and we will reach out to you on a recurring basis to have you test out some prototypes or websites or apps. The other way you can also, that's a little bit more labor intensive, but very helpful, is like working with community organizations, not-for-profits, working with things like libraries, which are often very willing to partner on any type of research work, is really, like for example, CBC back in January 2023, I believe, we did a cross-country library partnership program. So we went to 15 different libraries across the country with the sole intention of doing consultations and research and getting data. This is more labor intensive, but if you're not sure where to start and you don't have the funds, this is a great way to start.
Excellent. Everyone, please bring the questions and we will answer more after the session. Here's another one. Are there any examples of quick wins that you could share to help a team get started with specifically measuring their digital accessibility programs in progress?
Okay. Totally, maybe I have a question or I need a clarification. What do we mean by quick wins? Like when we saw measurement change quickly or
I think
perception?
you could probably define it in different ways. What I'm anticipating somebody to be looking for. What is it that I can do where I can get some immediate feedback, immediate progress, build momentum, have people feel great about what they've done, what they've accomplished, that sort of thing. That's how I'm interpreting it.
Okay, awesome. I think a great way, I'm going to skip back a few slides to the Skyscanner example, because automated tests can be pretty easy to set up and have dashboards. So I think this is a good starting point where you can have certain metrics pulled from it. Your team goes back, maybe they work on some developments, and as a result, you see the score go up right away. I think this is a great way to build some early sort of positive feedback. Another thing that's always worked and continues to work really well in any setting I go to, this is more qualitative, but having a user come in and live demo their experience with your product or service after changes have been made and for them to share how the experience might be different from what they've experienced before. There's nothing really that like builds a lot of momentum than something like that, if you want the qualitative aspect of it.
Very nice. Thank you. Next question here for you is, what are some organizations that measure well, especially interested in the education space by this individual?
Okay. To be completely transparent with you, I don't have a lot of great examples. Even prior to this talk, I was trying to look at what others have. It's not that there aren't measurement metrics or frameworks out there, but it's that it's not publicly available. I can maybe take this away as one of the questions that I can answer after and research a bit more in the education space and come back to you.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it would surprise me if that information is readily available in the public space. But if you can help with that, that'd be wonderful. Next question here is, are there specific benchmarking tools that you have found useful?
I, for a while, I was using Siteimprove's dashboard system. I found that to be quite interesting. I think it comes in with their browser plugin for free.
Hmm.
You can generate dashboard reports. That was a really cool, cool one to just even just try and see, hey, where's my particular product at? Yeah, that's the first one that comes to mind.
No?
Siteimprove.
All right. And when you answer the question online or whatever, you can feel free to elaborate. Next one here, does asking people about number of issues they identify cause problems with people trying to be less aware of issues?
Okay. If I'm hearing that correctly, it almost sounds like, is there a negative connotation with talking about number of issues? What is your interpretation of that question, Billy?
Kind of that too. It's like if the number of issues is really high, or does it cause people to shy away or you know, does it intimidate? I don't know. I'm kind of reading it, but I agree with you. I was not quite sure what the question is intending to ask, but that's kind of how I'm reading it.
Okay. I understand why you might feel that way. That's definitely it can be discouraging for teams if they're seeing the same numbers show up over and over again for a period of time. At that point, I would probably try and I would modify like how I focus or interpret the data. So I wouldn't purely just show like number of issues overall. I would try and break it out by flow a little bit. I would try and focus on newer product features or updates because that's a little bit more relevant. I'd also try and bifurcate to see if you can show wins and maybe products that are not doing so well. So having, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not important to show all data. Sometimes you can choose certain pieces of data that are a little bit more insightful, or might help boost a little bit more within teams.
Yeah, I would agree. And then help them with taking action on the data as opposed to it just being
That's
about the data, right? Helping people make progress with that. Totally agree. This one might be a little bit more, well, let me just read it for you. Setting accessibility goals should be pretty straightforward, right? You took us through that in the beginning of the session. What kind of difficulties should we anticipate when we try to have that conversation in our organization?
I think people can easily default to accessibility as a compliance requirement. So they might try to set a goal purely around compliance or monitoring. The challenge will come with when you're trying to talk about users with disabilities as your customers and how you're providing value to those users. It's the journey that I'm on today, where at first it was, okay, do we need to do this? Yes or no? Is this a compliance requirement? Yes or no? To now shifting to that inclusive design mindset of, okay, we do this, but what's the bigger benefit? What are other audiences as well who we can benefit as a result of doing this piece of work? So I think shifting the goals from being compliance focused to being more customer value and engagement focused, that's where you're going to start feeling a challenge and a push and a pull.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let me give you one more question, and then
Sure.
if you have a closing thought for our participants, I'd welcome that. This last question is, can you share an example of what would be included in an accessibility clause in a contract?
Oh,
And
absolutely. I'm happy to talk about it. So, accessibility clauses can start from being as simple as you, the supplier, will adhere to a certain standard and maintain the product against that standard over a certain period of time, like throughout the term of the contract. So that's like a very basic accessibility clause you can have in there. More advanced accessibility clauses can be more process oriented. So you're telling the supplier that they're responsible for example, conducting testing with people with disabilities on all new product releases or once every quarter. That's an example of a clause that I've included in the past. I've also included clauses around providing us with audit reports once a year, once every 2 years, depending on the scale and the value of the contract as well, and how frequently we use the product. So those are all ways. Other more qualitative accessibility clauses, you can include clauses around like evolution of accessibility for standards, or evolution in like around the roadmap of the supplier. So for example, you can include clauses to say the supplier is responsible for giving you a roadmap on accessibility every quarter, or during quarterly business reviews, they're responsible for walking you through it. So that's a little bit more qualitative. It's not something you can like, if they don't adhere to it, like, are you going to terminate the contract? Not necessarily, but that's also a type of clause you can include.
Nikki, thank you so much. You're super wonderful. Participants, you're awesome for all the great questions. Make sure everyone here to keep the conversation going on Discord in our community there. You can join via the link that is in the chat.